Ever since childhood, she blamed me for everything, for our parents fighting, for mom getting sick, for dad leaving. But the truth that surfaced later put everything in its proper place. Growing up in our house felt like walking on eggshells every single day. She was 4 years older than me, and from my earliest memories, I can recall her looking at me with this cold disappointment in her eyes. The words came early, and they came often. I was a mistake, an accident that should never have happened. According to her, everything bad in our family started the day I was born. The house was always tense. Mom would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring out the window with this distant look in her eyes. Dad would come home from work and immediately retreat to the garage, tinkering with tools and old car parts until well past dinner time. And there I was, this little kid trying to make sense of why everyone seemed so unhappy, why the air felt so thick you could cut it with a knife. She never missed an opportunity to remind me of my role in all this chaos. When Mom would have one of her episodes, sitting in her bedroom for days, barely eating, barely speaking, my sister would pull me aside and explain in that matter-of-fact tone that this was my fault. Mom had been fine before I came along, she'd say. Mom used to laugh and sing and cook elaborate dinners. But carrying me had drained something out of her, left her broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. The fights between our parents were the worst part. They'd start as whispered arguments behind closed doors, but they always escalated. Voices rising, doors slamming, sometimes the sound of something breaking. I'd hide in my room, pulling pillows over my head, but the sound still seeped through. And afterwards, when the house fell silent except for Mom's muffled crying, my sister would find me and deliver her verdict. This was because of me, because I had upset the natural order of things by existing. School became my escape, but even there I carried this weight. Teachers would comment on how quiet I was, how I seemed older than my years. I threw myself into books, losing myself in stories about other families, other lives that seemed so much simpler than mine. But every afternoon, I'd have to come home to that same heavy atmosphere, those same accusing looks. The worst part wasn't even the direct blame. It was how she made it seem so reasonable, so logical. She'd explain it like she was teaching me basic math. Before me, the family had been stable. After me, everything fell apart. The timeline was clear, the causation obvious. I was the variable that had changed everything, the catalyst for our family's destruction. Dad left when I was 12. I remember that morning clearly because it was a Saturday and cartoons were on, but nobody was watching them. The house was dead quiet, which was somehow worse than the usual tension. I found Mom sitting on the couch, still in her pajamas at 2 in the afternoon, holding a piece of paper in her hands. She looked up at me with these red, swollen eyes and tried to smile, but it came out all wrong. My sister appeared in the doorway and took in the scene with a kind of grim satisfaction. She didn't need to say the words. I could see them in her expression. This was the inevitable conclusion to the story that had started with my birth. Dad couldn't handle the stress anymore, couldn't deal with what I had done to his family. He'd finally reached his breaking point and chosen freedom over the burden of dealing with his mistake of a son. The years that followed were even harder. Mom seemed to fade more each day, becoming this ghost of a person who moved through the house like she was sleepwalking. My sister stepped into this role of family authority, making decisions and laying down rules, but always with this underlying current of resentment toward me. Every bill that came due, every problem that arose, every moment of stress, it all traced back to me in her narrative. I started working as soon as I was old enough, partly to help with expenses, but mostly to have a reason to be out of the house. The money I brought home was never enough, and my sister made sure I knew it. The financial strain we were under, the way Mom had to work multiple jobs just to keep us afloat, the way we could never afford the things other families took for granted. All of this was presented as direct consequences of my existence. High school was a blur of trying to keep my grades up while working evenings and weekends. I had dreams of college, of getting far away and starting fresh somewhere nobody knew my story. But even those dreams felt selfish, like another way I was abandoning my family responsibilities. My sister made sure I understood that leaving would be the final act of selfishness, the ultimate proof that I cared more about myself than fixing the damage I had caused. College did happen, eventually, though I had to piece it together with loans and part-time jobs and community college transfers. I studied hard, worked harder, and tried to build something that looked like a normal life. But the guilt followed me everywhere. Every happy moment felt stolen. Every success felt undeserved. I was living on borrowed time, building a life on the foundation of someone else's misery. After graduation, I found steady work and tried to maintain some connection with family, though every phone call home was an exercise in emotional endurance. My sister had appointed herself as Mom's primary caregiver, and she never let me forget what a burden this was, how she was sacrificing her own life to clean up the mess I had left behind. The implication was always clear: I owed them everything, and whatever I gave would never be enough. Update 1. Life continued in this pattern for years. I'd send money home when I could, visit on holidays, and absorb whatever guilt and blame came my way. I dated occasionally, but never let anyone get too close. How do you explain to someone that you're fundamentally broken, that your very existence ruined multiple lives? The relationships always fizzled out, and I told myself it was probably for the best. I threw myself into work instead, climbing the ladder and accumulating achievements that felt hollow. Success in the outside world meant nothing when I knew the truth about who I really was. At night, alone in my apartment, the old familiar thoughts would circle back. Maybe I should have never been born. Maybe everyone would have been better off without me. Maybe it wasn't too late to disappear, to stop being a burden on the people who were supposed to love me. The really twisted part was how normal this all felt. 25 years of carrying this narrative had made it as natural as breathing. I didn't question it anymore. I just lived with it, the way you live with a chronic illness or a permanent injury. This was simply who I was. The mistake that broke his family, the burden that kept on taking. Mom's health started declining more noticeably. Nothing dramatic, just this gradual fading that seemed to accelerate with each passing year. My sister's calls became more frequent and more accusatory. Mom needed more help, more money, more attention, and where was I? Off living my selfish life while she handled everything alone. The medical bills were piling up, and wouldn't it be nice if the person who caused all these problems in the first place could step up and take some responsibility? I increased the money I sent home and started planning more frequent visits, but nothing ever seemed like enough. Each conversation left me feeling drained and worthless, like I was falling further behind on a debt that could never be repaid. Sleep became difficult. Food lost its taste. The world took on this gray quality, like someone had turned down the saturation on everything. Work colleagues started commenting on how tired I looked, how distracted I seemed. I made excuses about family stress, which was true enough, but I couldn't explain the real weight of it. How do you tell someone that you're the reason your mother is dying slowly, that your sister is sacrificing her life to fix your mistakes, that your father couldn't bear to be in the same house as you? The breaking point came during a particularly brutal phone call. My sister had discovered some new expense related to Mom's care, and she unleashed years of accumulated resentment in one devastating monologue. I was selfish, I was ungrateful, I was the cause of every problem they'd ever faced. She painted a picture of Mom sitting alone in that house, fading away while her son lived in comfort, too absorbed in his own life to care about the people he'd destroyed. After that call, I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the wall and feeling like I was drowning. The guilt was so heavy I could barely breathe. Maybe it really would be better if I just disappeared entirely. Maybe the kindest thing I could do for everyone was to remove myself from the equation permanently. The thoughts that had always lurked in the background suddenly seemed very immediate and very logical. Update 2. That's when the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't my sister. The voice on the other end was older, gravelly, with a slight accent I couldn't place at first. He said he'd been trying to track me down for months, that he was an old friend of my father's and had something important to tell me. He'd heard about Mom's condition through mutual acquaintances and felt like he couldn't stay silent anymore. My first instinct was to hang up. I didn't need more reminders of how I'd driven Dad away, didn't need another person's perspective on my failures as a son. But something in his tone stopped me. There was urgency there, but also something like concern. He asked if we could meet in person, said what he had to tell me couldn't be said over the phone. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a diner on the outskirts of town, one of those places with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting too long. He was smaller than I'd expected, this weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands. He ordered pie and coffee and spent the first few minutes just studying my face, like he was looking for something familiar. Then he started talking, and everything I thought I knew about my family began to crumble. He'd known my parents since before I was born, he said, had watched their relationship develop, had been around during the early years of their marriage. And according to him, the problems had started long before I ever entered the picture. My sister had been a difficult child from the beginning, not just strong-willed or independent, but genuinely troubled in ways that my parents hadn't known how to handle. The first major incident happened when she was 14 and I was just a baby. Dad had come home early from work one day and found her in her room with older kids, doing things that made his blood run cold. Not just experimenting with substances, but serious stuff that could have destroyed her life before it even began. The confrontation that followed had been explosive, with accusations and threats and ultimatums that echoed through the house for weeks. Mom had wanted to get her help, to find counselors and programs that could address whatever was driving this behavior. Dad had wanted stricter discipline, clearer boundaries, consequences that actually meant something. They couldn't agree on the approach, and every conversation about it turned into a fight about parenting philosophy and whose fault it was that things had gotten so bad. The man across from me painted a picture that was completely different from the one I'd been living with. Instead of a happy family disrupted by my arrival, he described a household already in crisis, parents already at odds over how to help a child who seemed determined to destroy herself. My birth hadn't caused the problems. It had just provided a convenient scapegoat for everyone involved. But the real shock came when he started talking about the later years, the time period I remembered as the final collapse of our family. Mom hadn't lost her job because of stress related to my difficult birth, as my sister had always claimed. She'd been fired for missing too much work, and she'd been missing work because she was constantly having to deal with crises involving my sister. Calls from school administrators, meetings with law enforcement, court appearances for various infractions that had escalated over the years. Dad hadn't left because he couldn't handle the pressure of raising a mistake like me. He'd left because my sister had forged his signature on loan documents, racking up debt in his name for purposes he didn't even want to speculate about. The discovery of this betrayal had been the final straw in a marriage already strained to the breaking point by years of crisis management. Final update. Sitting in that diner booth, listening to this man systematically dismantle the narrative I'd built my entire identity around, I felt like I was experiencing some kind of psychological earthquake. Every assumption, every piece of guilt, every moment of self-hatred suddenly seemed questionable. If what he was saying was true, then everything I'd believed about myself and my family was built on lies. He had documentation, old letters from my father, photographs from family gatherings that showed the timeline differently than I remembered, even some official papers related to the legal troubles that had preceded Dad's departure. The evidence was overwhelming, but my mind kept rejecting it. How could something so fundamental be so wrong? How could I have lived 25 years believing a completely false story about my own life? The man seemed to understand my confusion. He explained that he'd stayed silent for so long because he'd assumed I knew the truth, that surely as I got older, someone would have told me what really happened. It was only recently, when he'd started hearing about how I was financially supporting Mom and taking responsibility for the family's problems, that he'd realized I was still living under the weight of my sister's version of events. We talked for hours, going over details and timelines, filling in gaps that I'd never even realized were there. He showed me pictures of Dad from before I was born, and I could see the stress already etched in his face, the weight of problems that had nothing to do with me. He described Mom's personality before the years of crisis wore her down, and it wasn't the happy, carefree person my sister had always described. It was someone already struggling with challenges that would only get worse over time. The drive home was surreal. I kept waiting for the relief to hit, for some sense of liberation from all those years of guilt. But instead, I felt confused and angry and somehow cheated. If this was all true, then I'd wasted decades of my life apologizing for things I'd never done, taking responsibility for problems I'd never caused, limiting my own happiness because I believed I didn't deserve it. That night, I called my sister. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't approach the conversation with the usual deference and guilt. Instead, I asked direct questions about the things Dad's friend had told me. I watched her scramble to maintain the old narrative, inventing new details and explanations on the spot. But now that I knew what to listen for, I could hear the desperation in her voice, the fear that her carefully constructed story was falling apart. She tried to turn it back on me, to make me feel guilty for questioning her version of events. How dare I listen to outsiders instead of trusting my own family? How could I be so selfish as to shirk responsibility when Mom needed me most? But the old manipulation tactics felt powerless now, like trying to use a key that no longer fit the lock. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, but for the first time, that didn't send me into a spiral of self-doubt and recrimination. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a kind of lightness, like a weight I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Over the following weeks, I started reevaluating everything. Relationships that had failed because I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve love. Career opportunities I'd turned down because I believed I needed to stay close to home and pay penance for my existence. Dreams I'd abandoned because pursuing them felt selfish when I owed so much to my family. I also started looking at Mom with new eyes. Instead of seeing her decline as something I'd caused, I began to recognize it as the result of decades of stress and crisis that had begun long before I was born. The woman who'd been worn down by years of dealing with a troubled child, financial strain, and a marriage that couldn't survive the constant chaos. My sister's calls became less frequent, and when they did come, they had a different quality. The old certainty was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. She seemed to sense that her version of events was no longer accepted without question, that the foundation of guilt and obligation she'd built her relationship with me on was cracking. I didn't cut contact entirely. That felt too much like abandoning Mom, who was genuinely sick and genuinely needed support. But I changed the terms of engagement. Instead of endless guilt and limitless financial support, I established boundaries. I would help with specific, reasonable expenses. I would visit on a schedule that worked for my life, not just when summoned for family emergencies. I would contribute to Mom's care without accepting responsibility for every problem that had ever befallen our family. The most profound change was internal. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I deserved happiness, that my existence wasn't a mistake that needed to be constantly atoned for. I started dating again, but this time I approached relationships without the crushing weight of believing I was fundamentally flawed. I made plans for the future that weren't centered around family obligations and guilt. It wasn't immediate or easy. 25 years of ingrained self-hatred don't disappear overnight. There were still moments when the old thoughts would surface, when I'd catch myself slipping back into familiar patterns of guilt and self-blame. But now I had context for those feelings, an understanding of where they'd come from, and why they weren't based in reality. My sister eventually stopped calling altogether. I heard through other family members that she was angry about my changed attitude, that she felt betrayed by my refusal to continue accepting responsibility for everyone's problems. But her anger felt like confirmation rather than condemnation. It told me I was finally seeing things clearly, finally refusing to participate in a fiction that had controlled my life for too long. Mom passed away 2 years later, and I was able to grieve her properly, not as the son who'd caused her suffering, but as someone who'd loved her despite the difficult circumstances that had shaped our family. At the funeral, my sister tried one last time to resurrect the old narrative, to make me feel guilty for not having done more, not having been better. But the words bounced off me like rain off a window. I'd finally learned the difference between taking responsibility for my actual choices and accepting blame for things that were never my fault in the first place. It was a distinction that changed everything, not just how I saw my past, but how I approached my future. For the first time in my life, I was free to be myself without the crushing weight of someone else's lies defining who I was supposed to be.